Hi everyone, my name is Emma Long. I am the head of the Department of American Studies at the University of East Anglia. And in this session, we are going to look at the rise of the United States and its emergence as a superpower, tracing that from roughly the middle of the 19th century through to roughly the middle of the 20th century. We've got quite a lot to cover. It's a busy period of time for the United States. So let's see how much of this we can cover as we go through. The US changed enormously in the century or so that we're covering in this session. In 1865, the US was politically and socially divided as a result of 4 years of civil war, which had just come to an end. Economically, the North had developed its industry and transportation as a result of the wartime necessity and was beginning to develop into a modern industrial economy. In the states of the former Confederacy in the South, however, the situation was different. Farms, businesses, and railroads lay in ruins, hit by the physicality of the war and the demands that it placed on citizens. Reuniting these two proved challenging, and the South remained economically behind the rest of the nation for decades. Some might argue that it's never quite caught up. The war brought slavery to an end, but the question of how the newly freed, formerly enslaved citizens would integrate into the nation was yet to be decided. In terms of government, the system still looked very much like the founders intended. The federal government was relatively small, with limited powers. Few presidents gained the status or profile of Abraham Lincoln, for example, and most political power remained with the state governments, which governed the daily lives of most Americans. A century later, the US was an economic powerhouse, having emerged from World War II as the nation's largest economy. As the ideological Cold War developed between the communist and capitalist nations of the world, the US became the leader of the capitalist or the Western group of nations, a symbol of political strength and seemingly the epitome of democratic nationhood. And now power rested firmly with the president and Congress at the center. States still retained some powers, but nothing like the authority or the power that they'd had in the 19th century. And while the US continued to address racial difficulties and continued to have problems with those racial difficulties, the civil rights movement had fought for and achieved enormous positive changes for the nation's people of color. How the US went from an economically weak and divided nation to the leader of the free world is a complex and complicated but fascinating story. We don't have time to cover everything that explains this story in this session, but we'll concentrate on three important elements: the economy, the impact of events external to the United States, and changing American attitudes towards the rest of the world. Ultimately, the foundation of American success as a world power was built on its economic strength. Arguably, it still is. At a basic level, a strong economy allows for greater innovation, encourages immigration to drive productivity, and it also helps pay for a strong military force for defense and security. And all of these things were important for American development in the century or so that we're looking at in this session. Now, the so-called Second Industrial Revolution from roughly the 1880s to the 1920s transformed the US economy. It brought the development of huge national and then international industries, the equivalent of multinational corporations like Unilever or Samsung or GlaxoSmithKline that we're familiar with today. Among the most famous from this period were John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which is still around today in the form of Esso, Andrew Carnegie's steel manufacturing plants, The American Tobacco Company, created by James Buchanan Duke, and of the ones listed here, the only one based in the former Confederate states in the South. And also International Business Machines, or IBM, at this point the world's leader in office supplies. Now, of course, we know them much more for computers. These and other business leaders innovated in business practices. Another good example of this is Henry Ford, for example, making the Model T Ford and helping develop the idea of the production line. They also pushed the boundaries of technological capability and led to an enormous growth in American manufacturing output that fed a domestic and increasingly an international market too. And the nature of the economy changed. Department stores flourished. Consumer goods like vacuum cleaners, electric sewing machines, the Kodak camera, record players, disposable razors, or razors with disposable blades, Gillette there, that you can see on the slide. All of these became increasingly available, and more options were also becoming available for the leisure hours that more and more people were beginning to experience. By the 1920s, President Calvin Coolidge was able to declare, "The business of the American people is business." American brands were available internationally, bringing a taste of American life to people abroad, and ensuring business leaders were engaged with international developments in the countries in which their businesses were based. But all of this, good as it sounds, was based on shaky foundations. The wealth gap was enormous. By 1929, the top 5% of the population owned more than the bottom 60% of the population. Poverty in rural areas and city slums was rife. Banking was unregulated, and corrupt business practices were common. Ultimately, it caught up with the US and the rest of the world in 1929 in the Wall Street crash, which saw stock prices tumble and ultimately led to the deepest international economic depression in history. As President Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933, over 25% of Americans were out of work, and the country's economic output, as measured by GDP, or gross domestic product, had almost halved from 4 years earlier. And you can see on the slide, so many people were out of work. People were thrown out of their houses and moved to these sort of shanty towns that became Hoovervilles, or became known as Hoovervilles, ironically after President Herbert Hoover, who was blamed for these. But even as all of this was going on, the nation's capacity for economic growth remained. So when World War II broke out in 1939 and the US mobilized initially to supply the Allied forces and then to support their own efforts after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the economy grew quickly and enormously. In fact, most economists and historians now believe that it was mobilization for World War II which brought the US out of the Great Depression after the Wall Street crash, and not the policies followed by Roosevelt's government. By 1944, American factories produced a ship every day and a plane every 5 minutes, which is just incredible when you think about it. Thousands of aircraft, 100,000 armored vehicles, and nearly 2.5 million trucks were produced by American factories during the war, while the government at the same time sponsored research that helped perfect technologies and inventions like radar, jet engines, and in fact early computers, which would then be put to civilian use after the war. The US emerged economically powerful after 1945, in contrast to many Western European nations whose economies had been devastated by the physical and economic destruction of the war. And this allowed the US to offer the Marshall Plan, which was financial aid to European nations to help recovery and rebuilding. But at the same time, Marshall Aid also encouraged European markets for American goods, which boosted the US economy further, and also intertwined the economy of the US with much of the Western world. And of course, this is something that it would use to its advantage as the Cold War began to develop and deepen from the late 1940s. By the mid-1970s, American companies and brands such as Coca-Cola, General Motors, Ford, IBM and DuPont, just to name a few, were familiar around the world, helping to maintain American growth and international influence. So economics are an important part of the story of the rise of the United States. See some of the brands here on the slide. Moving on to our second topic. American engagement with the rest of the world was influenced as much by events outside of US control as it was by American intentions. Now, there's a very big debate among historians about the extent to which the US was or was not an imperial power throughout the 20th century. But putting that slightly to one side for the moment, it's also, I think, important to recognise that part of the reason the US comes to have such an important international role is because other nations increasingly look to the United States to take that role. We see this happening today too. For example, thinking about the way the rest of the world has looked to the United States and to the American response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, where the United States not getting involved seems unthinkable. That has its roots in the period that we're looking at today, and in part because the rest of the world invites the United States in some instances. So thinking about the 19th century, the US maintained diplomatic relations with other nations throughout that period, but its most significant foreign engagement was with the nations within the American continent, so Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. This begins to change in the 1890s, in part as American missionaries take American religion and American religious beliefs around the world, and as American businesses we just mentioned looked for new and larger markets abroad. All of them are spreading American ideas with them as they go. American political influence often followed, although it was often halting. But the first major step of the United States into international affairs came with the Spanish-American War in 1898. Not actually a war in Spain, but a war to support Cuban independence from Spain. Obviously, Cuba's 90 miles off the Florida coast. The US was drawn in when the American warship, the USS Maine, exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 270 people. This splendid little war, in the words of Secretary of State John Hay, ended with US control of the Philippines, Puerto Rico and Guam, and Cuba as an American protectorate. And just to give you an idea of just how broadly across the world that spread American influence, you can see on the map here just how far apart those areas are that America now has responsibility for as it enters into the 20th century. Suddenly, the US has got an overseas empire, even if it's really unwilling to call it that. Shortly after this, in 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt became involved in helping to resolve the Russia-Japanese War, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts there. But beyond his individual role, it signalled the US as a diplomatic power, building on that acquisition of territory abroad to suggest that the United States was an ally worth having and perhaps had influence on the international stage, or was beginning to have that. Although, as you probably already know, the US did not enter World War I until 1917, President Woodrow Wilson used this growing international influence to try and influence the shape of the post-war Treaty of Versailles with his 14 points. which was the code that he had set out to shape American war aims and convince Americans that this was not an imperial adventure. What became the League of Nations was a version of part of his post-war vision. And although the United States ultimately didn't join the League of Nations, its existence between the wars was some evidence of growing American international influence. For reasons we're going to come and look at in a moment, the US took a step back from international affairs after World War I and retreated into a period of isolationism. And it took an unanticipated external event, the Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on the 7th of December 1941, to push the American people towards supporting American international engagement, something which has pretty much continued unlimited ever since. In 1941, the nation's physical distance from the war and its increasing economic strength as a result of having been supplying the Allies with more war materials made the US a valuable ally and ultimately ensured them a seat at the negotiating table when the war came to an end in 1945. President Franklin Roosevelt, whose 4 freedoms had defined American war aims, just as Wilson's 14 points had in 1917, drew on the nation's economic strength and his personal relationships with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to try to shape both the war and its end and the post-war world. Now, even though Roosevelt died in 1945 before the end of the fighting, his influence was felt in the discussions that followed, and in the formation of organisations like the United Nations and the World Bank, in which the US continued to play a significant role, unlike after World War I. Ultimately, their economic power gave them the ability, as we just mentioned, to offer the Marshall Plan, the program which guaranteed American engagement with nations around the world and spread American influence just as widely as it spread the dollar. Finally, in this section, we have to talk about the Cold War. Now, to what extent the US and the Soviet Union were to blame for the ideological conflict which dominated international affairs for the second half of the 20th century is a subject historians continue to debate and discuss. But even if we can lay the blame partly at the feet of the United States, some of the events were certainly outside the United States' control. But the Cold War ultimately guaranteed continued US global influence. Whether that was supporting nations economically to resist communist influence, so the Marshall Plan that we just mentioned, for example, or the Truman Doctrine, which gave aid to Greece and Turkey in the same period, or pressuring nations to follow particular policies to seem like stronger capitalist allies, interfering in the business of other nations to try and shore up favoured leaders, for example, Diem in Vietnam or the Shah of Iran, or to displace those leaders that the US disliked, thinking about Fidel Castro in Cuba or Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. Or the US was simply acting in ways which they argued symbolised the best that democracy and capitalism could offer the world. The concept of the US as the world's policeman, economically and militarily able to support allies in trouble around the world, grew out of this period and out of this early period of the Cold War. It's an image that ultimately was damaged by the experience of the Vietnam War and in more recent years by the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, but it remains an important image, and one that we've seen in relation to the Middle East and Ukraine in the very recent period. Okay, moving on to our third topic. Don't underestimate the power of American public opinion to shape the influence of the US on a global scale. The US is a democracy, and politicians are well aware that they need to keep their constituents happy if they want to get re-elected. And both historically and today, that gives public opinion an important influence over American policy, both at home and abroad. In the late 19th century, public opinion was divided, but probably leaned more towards skepticism of American international engagement. The acquisition of overseas territories as a result of the Spanish-American War upset some Americans, and what you see is the emergence of organizations like the Anti-Imperialist League. And they opposed what they saw as American territorial expansion, and what they also saw as American attempts to impose their will on the rest of the world. They didn't think that that's the sort of thing that the United States should be involved in. Or actually that they thought that that was not the legacy of the Revolutionary era in American history. They published pamphlets and newspapers and held rallies to publicize their critique of the American government policy abroad. And certainly many ordinary Americans feared that membership in the League of Nations that Woodrow Wilson was proposing would commit them to ongoing engagement with nations whose actions the United States couldn't influence, which was something very new to them and seemed like much too much of a commitment from where they were standing. In the end, the US Senate, which has to vote to approve all US domestic and international treaties, rejected the League of Nations Treaty in 1919 and again in 1920. And so the US remained outside of the League of Nations. And this sort of opposition to what was seen as American imperialism is a big part of that story. During the years of the Great Depression, Americans wanted the government to focus on relieving the problems at home, not on interfering abroad. So American international influence was largely unexplored in the years before, sort of, I guess, between the 1920s and 1941. Even when war broke out in Europe, President Roosevelt, keen to come to the aid of the Allies, could not convince Americans that they should break their isolationism. And, as we just saw, it took the attack on Pearl Harbor to change public opinion. But even then, Roosevelt was careful to define the nation's war aims in the language of rights and freedoms to avoid the kind of criticism that Wilson had faced 25 years earlier. But there was opposition to all of this, though. The leading organization in this period, as you can see in the slides, was the America First Committee. Largely xenophobic, anti-immigration, and so seen to be anti-Semitic as well. There were a lot of reasons that this committee didn't get a large membership, but it was there and it was critical of American involvement during World War II. Now, anti-communism has been part of American politics and society since the so-called Red Scare of 1919. Then the reaction was against both the recent Russian Revolution and the influence of nativist and xenophobic reactions against a new wave of immigrants who were deemed as radicals or socialists or communists. But this meant that as tensions with the Soviet Union rose after 1946, Americans were well versed in opposition to that nation's ideology, and politicians worked hard to stoke that fear in order to support their global actions. Communism, warned President Truman, was a, quote, false philosophy which purports to offer freedom, security, and greater opportunity to mankind, end quote, but which delivered instead only, in his words, deceit and mockery, poverty and tyranny. Not a lot of grey areas in that description. Or, in the words of President Dwight Eisenhower, Americans faced, quote, a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method, end quote. So when Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, who you can see on the screen there, claimed that there were communists in the American government in 1950, it touched on pre-existing fears and led to 4 years of hearings and investigations which bear his name. McCarthyism is a term we still use. But Americans' hatred of communism, largely unquestioned throughout most of the 20th century, helped to ensure that the United States did not fall back on its earlier isolationism and that it continued to take a leading role in world affairs, since Americans were told communism anywhere was a threat to American security at home. So the United States needed to be involved because it was important not just for the world but for Americans as well. So to bring all of this to a conclusion, economics, external events and public opinion were not the only factors which led the US to the place in the world it occupies today and that we're all familiar with, but they are important parts of the story. The nation went from politically divided, continent-bound in 1865 to the so-called leader of the free world by the end of our period in 1975. Today, of course, the US remains the only superpower since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. A tarnished and weakened power, perhaps, but still important and influential nevertheless. And given the importance of the three factors that we've talked about in this session, you might perhaps consider how a weaker US economy and changing American public opinion today, especially seen, for example, in support for President Trump's America First rhetoric during his presidential term, how these things might shape the US place in the world in the future as we go forward. Thank you.